Welcome to the Radiant Astrology Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Caudill. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Celtic tradition of Beltane and how we can honor the seasons in our modern life. We're really excited to be looking at the one, particularly this year, 2026, as it aligns with a Scorpio full moon. And to discuss all this, I have one of my absolute favorite guests, Miss Fern Vechunich from Wisestars Astrology. Hello, Fern. Thank you again for joining me today.
I'm so happy to be here, Christina.
Well, great. Well, I'm super excited to be diving into this topic. So much about what we do as astrologers isn't just at looking at the stars and the planets, how they align, but also the seasons, right? Because Western astrology is tied to the seasons, and there's some very good reason for that. And as we approach Beltane, we can help enlighten people on what it is, what it means. And I'd love to hear your perspective because you have decades of working with herbs and plants from a healing capacity, as well as 30 years as an astrologer. But before we press record, you had said, why don't we share a little bit about how we've been collaborating, how we met, and how people can kind of understand our connection. But do you remember, Fern, how we initially met? Because I was just thinking of that recently.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about it in context of we both have important placements in our 11th house. So, as I recall, I think I entered into a contest that you were having online on Instagram. And from there, I joined your summit. And then we just started working together. So that's what I remember. But I think when we started our ancestral astrology collaboration, my mom had just died, and we were kinda getting to know each other, and you'd mentioned that your mom had died not long ago, and it was around the anniversary of your mom's death that we were connecting, and I just remember that you were so kind to me. You hardly knew me, and you sent me this beautiful bouquet of flowers, and it was just really touched me, and I think that's, our Venus and water signs that, your Venus in Scorpio, my Venus in Cancer. There was just that real acknowledgement of a loss that you'd experienced and that I was going through, and that really, built some important trust and just a sense of, "This is a good person," so, yeah.
Aw. Yeah, I remember that because I was doing one of my summits. It was, I think, what was it, 2020, 2021, something like that. And I think it was 2020 because it was in the pandemic and I wanted to gather women astrologers to talk about astrology. And I put an open call for astrologers to apply. And one of the things was I said, I want to prioritize people who are, with a disability or other abled. We just want to have people who felt marginalized. And you had applied, and I thought this, and you submitted a video. I'm pretty sure, right? Because I
Thank
think we
you. It's
asked
been a
that,
while.
and I was like, wait a second, why is this gal? Why did she check the box of like disabled or whatever? And so I was like, and you had put in there that you were deaf, hard of hearing, and I was like, what? I totally got no sense of that at all. And so when we did work together, and I started, learning about you and how you've really just taken control of your life, like even though you have a degenerative hearing disease, right? But I was amazed how, number one, you're such an activist to help people to be more welcome in society that way, as well as I always believe that Chiron is about adapting, and you have really adapted, really well in ways that, is amazing to me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. There's so many misconceptions about people who have disabilities and what they're supposed to look like or sound like or how they're supposed to act. And so, I'm me, but I also know I carry part of, my identity is I have a hearing loss. And it's actually a hereditary, hearing loss. Many folks who don't have perfect hearing have nerve cells in their ears that start to harden, and that's that goes in my family. So that was part of my interest in the ancestral astrology as well, and ancestral healing is just looking at the dynamics and charts that show up in people and how they manifest.
And I will say too that what was really helpful from you was I wanted to make sure at that time that that event we were hosting, we had accommodations for people because this was before Zoom had any like closed captions or anything like that. So we had to
That's right, I
hire another
yeah.
service, and it cost all this money, and
Oh,
just in case
right.
like one other person have, thank God like Zoom caught up really quickly, and hopefully it's for people speaking up. And then I'm not sure how, I don't remember the point where we decided let's collaborate, but somehow we started talking about ancestral astrology. And my mother had passed away 2015, and it was like literally midnight between November 1 and November 2nd, which is, the Day of the Dead, the Samhain, right? Like November 2nd is Samhain, and it's about honoring the dead and honoring their memory and paying homage to them, and it seemed like such a perfect portal, and we were so excited about doing this course, and it was like on the precipice of it, and then your mother passed, and I thought, oh my goodness, do we have, if we have to pause this or cancel this or something, we'll do whatever we have to, because I remember when my mom passed, it was like I was suddenly thrown into this vortex of like I didn't know what world I was in, because it was the first time I'd ever had a someone close to me pass away, and it was sudden, in my case. But you were, you took a couple days for yourself, but you were intent on moving forward with that process, with the course.
Yeah, definitely it throws you for a loop, and it was actually real I think I remember talking with you at the time, and it felt like a really beautiful way to honor my mom by talking about the ancestral patterns that run through the charts with people. So it turned out to be a very I have Moon in Aquarius, it was a very healing way, to navigate that time. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've spent a lot of time in Mexico too, right? And you've actually been to the Day of the Dead festivals.
Yeah, well, mostly actually in San Francisco. We've been to a couple in Oaxaca, but, I lived for a long time in San Francisco's Mission District, and they have some very, it used to be a little more folksy, but gotten more commercial in recent years, but they used to have some really beautiful, powerful, artistic, creative Dia de Muertos ceremonies on the street in the Mission District, so
Oh, amazing. We're gonna have to go together one day.
yeah, yeah,
Bring
one of
everything
these.
full circle. And what is so amazing too, though, is so we had this connection. We ran that course for a few times, right?
Mhm.
And I think maybe was it last year we didn't, and I felt something was missing. And so I told you earlier this year, I was like, we need to reconnect every year at that time because otherwise, I feel like that I'm not really fully honoring that time, unless we're doing something to bring people together. And then we started talking about doing another program because we just love to teach together, and you brought up Beltane, and I didn't realize that Beltane and Samhain are like sort of like the opposites. Like, how a lot of Western astrology is based on the seasons. And so when we have our neighbors down south, like we have plenty of clients, I'm sure, in Australia and New Zealand, and they're always so frustrated with, Western astrology because opposite of the season that they're currently in. And but what's interesting is, when we're in Samhain in November timeframe, they're in Beltane. And then now that we're coming into Beltane, which for us is May 1st, they will be in Samhain. And I've always heard, I think we have all always heard that it's Samhain, it's the veil is the thinnest between worlds, and so that's why it feels like, like even Halloween, we can almost celebrate death, which in the Western world, we don't usually do that. We stay far away from any idea of death or anything like that. But something about that time period, it kind of softens that resistance. And so if you think about it, then, that veil being thin is, they say it's true for both Beltane and Samhain, whereas Samhain is honoring death and Beltane is the celebration of life. So do you want to talk more about what you know of Beltane and how we can honor it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like Samhain and Beltane are kind of like peanut butter and jelly, They are connected, they go together. And of course, when Samhain occurs and Dia de Muertos and Halloween around that same time period, it's all in the first decan of Scorpio. And with Beltane, that's the first decan of Taurus. And of course, Taurus and Scorpio are opposing signs. And so here we are now. We're in Taurus season, and we're actually headed toward not only Beltane, but why this year, 2026, is so interesting and such a standout is that it's also the lunar Beltane. And so usually every year, lunar Beltane happens on that full moon in Scorpio when the sun is in Taurus and the moon is in Scorpio, but it's often in a different date as the official day for Beltane. But this year they happen to coincide. So to me, there's a particular resonance, an emphasis, particularly on the lunar kind of side of things, that this is going to be a very deep, emotional, powerful kind of marking time to really look at questions of life and death and fertility and decay and all those kind of opposites that Taurus and Scorpio symbolize.
Well, yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And the idea of like the fire, right? Because at Beltane, they light the Beltane fire. I just wanted to read a little bit about what I pulled off about Beltane. It says that it's a Gaelic festival marking the beginning of summer, but it's roughly midway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, right? And so the celebration begins at sunset, April 30th, because ancient Gauls marked the start of a new day at sundown. And so it is also one of the four main sort of portals, the Gaelic seasonal festivals.
These are the cross quarter days, and the Celts and modern day pagans and witches, they celebrate the whole wheel of the year. So we've got the two solstices, the winter solstice and the summer solstice. Winter solstice represented by Capricorn at 0 degrees of Capricorn. Summer solstice is the opposite sign, 0 degrees of Cancer. And then we have the equinoxes, and those are the cardinal signs. So we've got the spring equinox and the fall equinox, and that's going to be Libra and Aries. Now, so we've got the solstices and the equinoxes kind of holding that space, but then we have also the fixed signs, and those are the cross quarter days. And just like you named, those happen kind of in the middle of the solstices and the equinoxes. February 2nd and August 2nd are the other cross quarter days for the fixed signs. Okay, so what we're looking at here, this is a visual for folks who are visual learners. We have the Celtic names, and this says Lugnasa, but we also call it Lammas, and it's a celebration of Lu, the Sun King. Um, and he's kind of a mythical god. Well, he's a god, Lu, the Celtic god, but he evolves throughout the year. But this is his wake. And then at Samhain, it's the death. At winter solstice, it's the birth. And then he grows and he marries at Beltane. And then summer solstice is the celebration of his wedding to the goddess. So the goddess births him and then she marries him. So it's a whole kind of strange mythical story that evolves throughout the wheel of the year. But Beltane is when they first come together. And that's why Beltane is known as a celebration of love and fertility and creation.
Right, and life, right? So it's like the life celebration, whereas Samhain is essentially honoring death. Is that correct?
Exactly, it's the counterpoint. And you know what you're talking about with the Beltane fire, because these are the cross quarter days are fire celebrations, and they all incorporate an element of fire into them. But Beltane has this cleansing quality to it where you're purifying and cleansing the past or cleansing away winter and the coldness and kind of being stiff and frozen, and you're moving and you're dancing and the maypole, of course, is part of that ritual creation of life. And so when you're weaving the ribbons and dancing, you're making the dance of life come back again for the next year.
Yeah, and it says that the fire traditions at Beltane are such that all of the household fires would be extinguished. And I imagine back then they used fire a lot for lighting, things at night and cooking constantly. And so they would be extinguished and then they'd be relit from one single communal Beltane bonfire. So which is why they do bonfires at Beltane. And then they would have the livestock driven between twin fires, I guess, to sort of honor them. And people would walk through the smoke or leap smaller flames for protection and renewal. And you said something about leaping over a broomstick. What's that about?
Well, there's in the when I was part of, a collective in San Francisco where we did Beltane May dances every year, we had a cauldron and a broom. So, this also shows up in African American kind of folk culture where people would marry, they'd handfast, and, they would jump over a broom. And so there's a lot of meaning to that broom and honoring the hearth flame, but it's also stepping into that new life with somebody. So you'll see couples who maybe they're not married yet, they're dating. When we would do the May dances, they would jump over the fire and the broom together. And you'll hear also, that there's May weddings, they hand fast for a year, but they break apart after that. So it's not like an official wedding, it's just a May wedding. They would say that couples would go and, have sex in the fields to fertilize the fields on May Day. That was part of the tradition. So there's a lot of that flowing
So
around.
interesting. And I've heard there's this phrase, I think they use it more in Britain to say like May December wedding, which is like a young person marrying a really old person.
Yeah.
Like the young person's May, the old person's December.
But just going back to Beltane tradition, we used to gather tons of flowers, and before we did our Beltane ritual, we would make flower crowns, and that was one of my favorite parts
I
about
love that.
creating these beautiful flower crowns with the people and having a picnic, and that is something that's still celebrated. It's been celebrated for hundreds and thousands of years. So that's one of my favorite Beltane traditions. Yeah.
And even just gathering the wildflowers and, creating sort of a wand of them or something, you're honoring that it's sort of fresh life, and so in that way you're capturing the magic in a way.
Yeah, and the fertility of spring, things growing and blooming. I mean, there's so much richness to those traditions.
And so I think what's so interesting is that it aligns with the Scorpio full moon this year. So the Scorpio full moon, I always love to pay attention to for various reasons. I mean, I'm very fixed sign orientated. So, these things fascinate me. And even though a lot of times they're not very easy, right? When you have fixed signs, like especially when they're, aspecting each other in hard aspects. But the Scorpio full moon is also when it tends to be when the Vesak festival is, which in Buddhist tradition is, it's said that is when the Buddha gained enlightenment, when Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, he gained enlightenment. Some say it's the day that he was born, died, and was enlightened. Like all those three things all happened on a Scorpio full moon. But I think what's really especially interesting about that is when you think about the enlightenment that the Buddha attained, that essentially, Siddhartha Gautama was a prince who, was protected behind these walls with all this wealth and lived in luxury. And his family always said, don't ever go beyond the walls of the palace because you don't want to see what's out there, because there's suffering out there and there's poor people and the disease and things like that. But when he did go beyond that, he realized this is the state of the world. And who am I to be hoarding so much for myself? I need to be out in the world and suffering with people. And compassion is actually defined by suffering with. That's actually how it's translated to mean. And so the meditation he did under the Bodhi tree was to release all of his attachments, his material attachments, so that they wouldn't stand in the way of the Shakti, which is that unconditional love and everything. And that to me is one of the higher expressions of the Scorpio full moon, because you have the sun in Taurus, right? There's that sense of groundedness there. And the moon in Scorpio is very much associated with transformation, And so even that sense of, sun in Taurus, Taurus can be clinging to what makes us feel safe for our survival, for our, biological survival or our possessions or something like that. And Scorpio is often associated with what is beyond, taking a risk to go beyond into the unknown and to release all those things that keep us so attached to this world. And it might also be the fact that I have South Node in Taurus and North Node in Scorpio that I always felt that this particular time of year, it can be very sacred if we are aware and conscious of it.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting the stories and various traditions. The pagan tends to be a little bit more celebratory around this time, around the earthly pleasures. And I like with the intention piece, yes, like the more that you stop and kind of set some intentions during this time and align with it. When in astrology, we're all about aligning with the cycles, aligning with nature. So, how can we align with this time, right? That's the question that I would like to explore in our upcoming class that we're going to be doing. Yeah.
Yes, and what is so amazing about it is we're going to be kicking off that weekend after of Beltane and the Scorpio full moon, and what we really wanted to do is look at, again, this is the year of the fire horse, so it's about fire. It's about finding our courage to go into the unknown, and again, I really feel like that's what Scorpio is about. It's going into where angels fear to tread, as they say. Even though Pluto has been in Aquarius for, has it been almost 2 years now? We're still figuring out the landscape. And it's really creating this, big landscape that we're in is undeniable. We've got Uranus entering Gemini this weekend, in a couple days from when we're recording this. We've got Jupiter, as Jupiter always, goes into a new sign. It takes a year in a sign, is going from Cancer to Leo, which should be very interesting. Talk about if we thought we didn't have enough fire,
I know,
Jupiter
I
going into a fire
know.
sign, Leo of all things. And what's the other? Oh, Neptune.
And
Oh,
Saturn,
forget
yeah.
Neptune.
Yeah, we
Neptune and
everything is shifting to fire and air. That's what we've talked about a lot as we've been planning this course is, okay, how do we navigate this fire and air landscape and understand it and align with it? Yeah.
right. So going from mostly earth and water to fire and air and just sitting with that. It's sometimes we can get so up in our heads with aspects and signs and things. And then when we can just go back to the very basics of the elements and understand, are we understanding the element? And that's probably what we're feeling is so uncomfortable as we've been in this. When you think of earth, earth wants to be grounded, water wants that comfort and that flow and that feeling, that feeling good and that flowing with one another and feeling where you belong and, that familial, all that good Cancer stuff. But, it's almost being like shot out into, fire, of course. Fire can be everything from that enthusiasm to and the passion to, the anger and the war and the, losing your head to the air, which can be very more objective, it's the mental realm and things like that, which can be kind of can sense if you're going from the coziness of, the touchy feeliness of water into air. Some people will be more at home there.
I know. It's really, I think, gonna be interesting to see the relationship between people's natal birth charts and this changing planetary landscape and how they navigate it. Because I think for folks who have a lot of earth and water, it can be potentially destabilizing at first. But I think that there's a way that they can approach it if they have all the, information and the tools at their disposal that can also be enlivening and empowering and hopeful. So hopefully, we will lay out that information and tools in our course in a way that it offers guidance for people and some, guideposts as they move through this new terrain.
hmm So, we want to invite everyone to check out the link in our show notes where we're going to be taking week by week, looking at these different shifts, the shifts in the elements, the shifts with the planets changing signs, and bring your birth chart to the party, basically, because that's one of the best things when we gather together is that you're not just abstractly looking at these concepts. You're saying, how is this activating my natal chart? How is it showing up in my life? How can I move with more consciousness and intention? And then also hearing from the other students to hear their experience. And, it just really makes the astrology come alive.
Yeah. No, and I think, every element and every planet has a shadow side and then a more kind of agreeable side. And I think it's important to get to know both so that you can learn how to work with them. And in this course, we'll be talking about both. How can this planetary elemental energy show up in a way that we're really going to enjoy and welcome? And also, how can it show up in a way that's going to mirror things back to us that we might not want to look at? But let's build the tools that we can work with that shadow manifestation.
Mhm. And it's interesting because, like, I just, even the past, couple weeks, I've been hearing so much about, the acceleration of AI and all this stuff, and the change in our lives and the workforce and things like that. And that will, like, certainly change a lot in our lives, but all of the 12 zodiac signs and the elements, they're not going away. Some of them are more emphasized at times than others. But I feel like we can get disconnected when we think everything is, oh my God, we're destined to just, be in this Aquarian space, which is true. There's a lot of emphasis in, Aquarius and Gemini, but the beauty also of our natal charts, it kind of just shows us what our natural tendencies are. And then we can look at, where, as you said, where can we find more ease? Where can we find sort of a release valve? What do I need, to take care of my own nervous system and, these kinds of things. So I think it's really important that whenever we look at, this big changing landscape, we also look at our own personal lives and our own personal needs that are really revealed through the natal chart.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's all kind of a chemistry experiment. There's going to be new chemicals being thrown into the potion. And it's like, how do we work with that? What are we creating and how are we co creating?
Well, I remember our last course we did together, which was actually funny enough the same time last year, and we didn't even plan that.
Oh,
We
yeah.
were like, oh,
No.
let's just do a straight up astrology course on like the houses, and it just so happened to be at like the Beltane time. I think we're just drawn to each other like during these times. And,
Yeah.
I remember some people had said in this time of disconnection, it's so nice to come together and connect with other humans, and talk about these things that are important to us. And even though we might feel like oh, astrology is everywhere. Everyone's into astrology. It's actually still a very niche thing, believe it or not. And then also, when you're talking about the type of astrology and using astrology, for the purposes of healing, for the purposes of inner insight and development, that also, takes a very special sort of community to come together to really delve into that.
Yeah, no, we had a great group of people we worked with last year, and I'm looking forward to, seeing some of those faces again and some new faces.
Great. Well, as we wrap up, is there anything else you want to leave us with about Beltane and how we can move into this season of fertility and creativity?
Yeah, I think, this it's definitely a time of purification and renewal and celebration of life. So whatever that means to you to honor that time is coming up. So I think the more intention and focus and just awareness that we bring to it, the more that we have a really sacred experience.
Absolutely. That's so beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Fern. And again, everyone, I invite you to check out radiantastrology.com where we have all the information on our course. We're welcoming everyone who is interested in exploring the astrology with a community of like minded people and just seeing how we can move into this whole new world that is coming, like it or not, or ready or not. Here it comes. Or likely
Yeah.
to.